Hi, how's it going, everyone? Dean Kulaweera here, your host for Tech Talks with the Tech Recruiter. Welcome to the show. Very excited about this week's episode. I have with me Danny Pehar, who is a cybersecurity expert. I will be introducing to him to all of you shortly, but just to give everyone a heads up, all the links for connecting with Danny on his social media, it should be in the description or the comments. Danny is someone very active on. I'm connected to him on LinkedIn, so I follow him on LinkedIn. He's very active there. Always shares a lot of great information and content, not just for cybersecurity professionals, but also for the everyday regular person such as myself and maybe you watching this. Maybe you're a non-technical person like myself. A lot of great information, very easy to understand. So make sure you hit pause, make sure to connect with him or follow him on his social media links. Now, before I go and again tell you more information about Danny, I did want to give everyone a heads up regarding what's going to be covered today. We have a very exciting episode. So Danny will be discussing with us, first and foremost, why is cybersecurity something important? Like, is it even something important for, again, the average everyday person like myself? We're going to be speaking about what are the most frequent type of cyber attacks that most of us are targeted for, and what are the motives of these attackers and criminals, right? We're going to be discussing that. Danny's going to be sharing his expertise on that. Also, we'll be speaking about, again, what are those areas where we might be unknowingly at risk in our day-to-day lives? And what are some simple ways we can safeguard ourselves? Also, Danny will be speaking about the risks that organizations might be at who are currently suddenly working 100% remote. And we'll be speaking about various other interesting and exciting topics within cybersecurity. So just more information about Danny, folks. So Danny is, again, a cybersecurity expert, and he's a member of the Forbes Technology Council. So that's a monthly cybersecurity content contributor to Forbes magazine. Really impressive. His media portfolio also includes regular television appearances. He has worked closely with the Toronto Police Cyber Task Force, as well as the FBI Cyber Task Force. Really, really cool. He's a best-selling author and cybersecurity specialist, a keynote speaker, and a trainer. So, folks, we have pretty much an expert in the house, and I'm really excited about this conversation. Danny, thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, Dean, it's my absolute pleasure. And, before we get into the show, I just want to point out what I think is really cool about you and me is we met during the COVID-19 crisis.
Exactly.
We met virtually.
Exactly.
And you know what? Yeah, this is the way it's being done now, and we're doing it. And this is great. Like, I feel like I know you, and we only met during this time. So I absolute honor to be here. And I think it's really cool that you're doing this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much, Danny. And yeah, pleasure to be connected with you. And yeah, just like Danny said, folks, a lot of people are connecting in the same way that myself and Danny are. So make sure you're putting yourself out there as well, so you can make these great connections. So Danny, without further ado, let's get right into it. So Danny, what is cybersecurity, and why is it an important topic for everyone? And is it an important topic for, the non-technical person such as myself?
Yeah, excellent. Great way to start. Okay. So you asked kind of a two-parter there. So yes. I'm going to start off with the first part. Anytime I answer any question about what is cyber something, I always like to take it back to what it is that we already know. Okay, so if we want to talk about what is cybersecurity, well, let's first talk about what is physical security. Yeah. Essentially, when we're talking about physical security or security of any kind, we are really talking about protection. So protection against what? Well, protection against any number of threats, or protection against any number of vulnerabilities that we might have that might make us weak to those threats. Now, when we talk about cybersecurity, it's really the same thing. It's about protection, except specifically for the threats and the vulnerabilities brought on by the digital age. So I think that's probably the best and simplest way to explain it and to understand it. Now, let me go to the exciting part of your question.
Right.
Why should a regular person be concerned about cybersecurity? Yeah, we hear about the big companies, we hear about the banks, we hear about the governments, that they're under some sort of attack. But what about the average Joe? Is this something we need to be aware of? The best way to understand that is to understand, you have to ask yourself, do I have something of value to a cyber criminal? So if you want to understand whether any kind of security is important to you, that's the question you have to ask yourself. Do I have something of value to a criminal? Because if I do, then 100% I've got to consider that threat factor. The other question is, am I in a state where I might be vulnerable to that criminal? It goes back to threats and vulnerabilities. As for regular people, yes, 100%. We all have things. Doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter how young you are, doesn't matter how much money you think you don't have. We all have things that the cyber criminal wants. So 100%, this is very relevant even to your average citizen.
Okay, understood. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, obviously all of us have information that is valuable, right? And can be compromised as well as taken advantage of by someone that knows how to do their stuff and get their way in. So makes perfect sense, Danny. Now, Danny, on the subject of cyber attacks, so can you tell us, like, what are some of the most frequent type of cyber attacks most of us might be targeted for, and what are the usual motives of the attacker or the criminal?
So I'm going to answer your question in reverse of how you asked. So let's talk about the motives first. Okay. So the motives that we're seeing when we are talking about your individuals, right? So strip away political motives, strip away cyber terrorism, strip away, some sort of big motive like that. Let's talk about individuals. Individuals, it's almost always something financially based. Okay. So what happens is one typical example could be a cyber criminal breaches an average citizen, and what they do is they take information from that citizen. So it goes back to what I was talking about. We all have something of value, and what they're looking for is they're looking for information, sensitive information, driver's license number, passport number, birthdays, health information. Now what they do is when they take that, they sell that on the dark web. And in case we don't know, the dark web is the digital underground where you can essentially buy and sell whatever you want. And so that information is worth a lot of money, more so than we might think. A lot of times people are good at protecting, as an example, their credit cards, but they might not think to protect their health information. Health information sells for 10 times more on the dark web than your credit card information. So what's the buyer doing with it? When the person buys it, so if I steal it from you, I may want to separate myself from the original crime. So I might not steal it from you and do something with it. My goal would be to sell it, okay? Now, once I've sold it, the buyer then, they're going to do one of two things, or both, or any combo. And one is going to be, they're going to use that information to probably take out a loan in your name. So some sort of identity theft for that reason. But then the other reason, very important to remember, that many times the buyer may not actually have it attached to a loan. Maybe they just want to do the nefarious things that they're doing on the dark web, and they'd rather do it in your name rather than theirs. Keep in mind, again, the dark web is home to so many crimes bigger than cybercrime itself. And I say that story, I think that's a really important story to say, because sometimes when I start talking about identity theft and loans, one of the responses that I hear is, but Danny, I've got no money, so no one's coming after me. Yeah, they don't care if you don't have any money, because that doesn't matter to them. Your identity is still worth a lot of money on the dark web. So that's kind of a long answer to a short tail end of your question about the motive. Let's go back to the other question. What types of attacks? A lot of times I will hear news sessions, or I'll hear people discussing, well, they'll go very, very deep inside, let's say, malware, as an example. And then they'll talk about different types of malware: spyware, trojanware, ransomware. Mal is short for malicious ware, short for software. All those other things, they're just evil forms of software. Really, the weapon that I want to talk about, the style of attack, the hacker's favorite style of attack, or cyber criminals' rather favorite style of attack, is psychology. That's really what we're seeing a lot of. So what they do is they play off of our fear, our sadness, even our happiness and our anger. And they get us thinking so that we're not thinking straight. We're thinking with emotion. And then we're susceptible to their trickery. And yes, sometimes it may be to download some malware. Sometimes it may be to download. At the end of the day, whatever it is you're downloading, who cares? It's irrelevant. It's something really bad. We want to prevent that from happening in the first place. And one of the best things that I tell people is keeping in mind that psychology is one of their best weapons. Before you're so quick to do something in response to something that was texted to you or emailed to you or what have you, take a second, take a deep breath, and count to 10. When you feel your emotions really rise from fear, sadness, happiness, or anger, take 10 seconds and just ask yourself, hang on a second, does this make any actual sense? And sometimes those 10 seconds could be the difference between being scammed and not being scammed.
Amazing. And what you're saying is absolutely right, because no matter how good of a technology, technology you have in place, or security measures and all of that, all it takes is for someone to get by through all of that, just using their psychology and getting you to make certain decisions, certain acts. You mentioned text messages and stuff like that. So it's a very important thing, I think, that's not being spoken about enough, because mostly you hear about people speaking about the technology, the technical aspects of things, but you bring up a very important point, and it makes perfect sense. Now, moving on to I guess, and you kind of mentioned it, Danny, regarding the psychology aspect, but this brings me to like a great article I read that you wrote, or that I believe you sent it over to me, and you used the analogy of a well-guarded, fortified house in relation to cybersecurity threats. Can you please like tell the viewers more about that analogy you made?
Sure. Yeah, 100%. So imagine you live in a house. It's got unbreakable doors, unbreakable windows, locks, unbreakable walls. That amazing protection that you're surrounded by is going to do you little good if you open the door every time somebody knocks on the door, and you listen to whatever story they tell you, and you just keep opening that door, or maybe even you never close it to begin with. And so that really speaks to something that you and I were touching on beforehand, and that is, we cannot afford to be so naive to think that a single piece of technology is going to protect us. We really have to take our protection in our own hands and really understand good awareness, good cyber hygiene. And don't get me wrong, I love technology. We do need to be able to automate our response. Of course, we need technology to protect us, but we just can't be so naive to think that we now don't need to be responsible. I actually came up with that analogy because I was at a high school, and I was talking about cybersecurity awareness, and this young gentleman came up to me and he goes, Danny, I appreciate you coming out here, but I really don't need any help. I got this figured out. And I was like, yeah, wow, all right. Well, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I don't know anyone that's got it figured out. So tell me, like, what's your secret? And he's like, I've got an iPhone and I've got a Mac at home. And I think we both know that they can't get hacked. So I don't need to worry about any of your lessons. And I was like, yeah, so that's really wrong. And by the way, I love Apple. I have an iPhone, but yeah, that's a lie. They are certainly susceptible to being breached, just like any technology is. But let's pretend that they're not. Let's pretend it was amazing. How is it going to help you when you are willfully being tricked to willfully put your information out there, right? Mm-hmm. Or when you're willfully putting too much on Facebook or too much on Instagram or what have you, and someone, in some cases, doesn't even need to actually hack you. They just Google your name and really pull off what you already freely put up there, right? Yeah. So that's really, I think we need to take a step back and understand technology. Of course, it's necessary. Of course, it has its place. Apple, of course, is a great company, but we cannot rely on somebody to protect us. We really need to know the basics and protect ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw your video where you described this situation, and I smiled because, you know what, I used to think the exact same thing. Like, I don't know where this whole theory came about, that if you have a Mac, if you have an iPhone, you're good. It's all good. You're not a threat. You're not at risk of getting hacked or anything of that sort. I used to believe that as well. So folks, look, you got to question all these things that you might be hearing about, right? And it's a great point. And I remember seeing like this YouTube prank video where this guy was basically going around and he was just going up to people and saying, "Hey, what's your password?" And people were just like, have you seen that?
No, I did.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example, right? Like a complete stranger comes up, and you're caught totally off guard, and you just give up the password, right? And it's not to say that those people were foolish or something of that sort. It's just that element of surprise and I guess some psychology there.
A little bit of surprise, a little bit of psychology.
Yeah.
And someone can argue, well, that guy had a camera, so maybe they want to be on TV and they were playing along. You can argue that, but we do see those kind of scams every day. And the really popular one in Canada was the CRA scam. Hey, you're going to be in handcuffs within the hour. And sometimes when we talk about that, sometimes we might be quick to almost poke fun at those people, right? Like, how could you fall for that? You're being asked to pay the CRA on an Apple ID gift card. Like, why on earth would the CRA want to be paid like that, right? But what we need to understand, though, is when you're in that emotional state, it's not a question of logic because you're not thinking logically. So you can say, logically, how could you fall for that? Well, they weren't thinking with logic. They were thinking with emotion. That's how they fell for it. And maybe You might think, we might think, well, I wouldn't fall for that. But that's only because our emotional trigger point wasn't hit. But trust me, when it's hit, holy cow, it really gets hard to avoid. That's why we really need to take that 10 seconds, take a deep breath before we do anything.
Yeah, and I love that advice, Danny, about taking 10 seconds, let that emotion kind of subside or pass through, and then really take a good look at it. I mean, that's some great advice. Now, Danny, can you provide us with some examples, like how might we unknowingly be at risk in our day-to-day lives, and what are some simple ways we can safeguard ourselves, of course, aside from the psychological aspects that you mentioned?
Sure. So one of the ways I'm going to touch on two things, right?
Yeah.
One of the ways that I see constantly as one of the biggest problems that we have with regards to being at risk is not knowing what the bad guys actually want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so so I'm going to take you back on, I'll give you another analogy, another story. Imagine you are walking in a dark alleyway and it looks like a scene out of like some sort of like dangerous action movie, okay? And you don't feel safe. And you've got these guys and they look mean and dangerous and whatnot, walking, some sort of gang walking towards you. And imagine you've got a wad of cash in your pocket. Are you going to pull your cash out in front of this place that you feel scared and start counting it, right? No, you're probably not. You're probably going to clench it really tight, keep your head down, and get out of there, okay? And why is that? Well, that's because by nature, I find humans are pretty secure by nature. We only, unfortunately though, live in a world where things have changed so much. What we need to protect and secure has changed, right? So what we need to protect and secure when it moves from just cash to another form of currency, that's when we get a little bit careless. Not necessarily our fault. It's just that we haven't learned that this is the new currency. Now let's talk about currency for a second. So, well, why do we know that currency is valuable? When we say currency, why do we know it's valuable? There's really four things that really make us understand that it's valuable. And the four things are, with currency, everyday currency is bought, it's sold, it's traded, and it's stolen, right? You can do that with any kind of money, any kind of currency. That's what's happening with our data. Every single day. People will argue every minute of the day. Some people will argue every second of the day. It's being bought, it's being sold, it's being traded, and it's being stolen. And so all of these things out there are worth so much. So the first thing that I tell people to do, really the first step is take a step back and have an understanding of what kind of sensitive information you have access to. Things like your passport number, things like your driver's license number, birthday, birthplace, citizen or immigration status. Take note of that and make sure that you talk to your family about that and understand, hey guys, this is the new currency and we got to protect this the same way that we protect any currency, except for the fact that you can argue it's even more vulnerable than currency. Picture yourself, you're at a Starbucks, you got a big bag of cash, someone wants to steal that from you, okay, right off your table. They have to make an effort to steal that from you. And you'll know immediately, hold it down, being compromised, right? You can shout for the cops, you can do something about it. But with data, it doesn't have to physically be taken from you. Somebody just needs to take a picture of it or record it or whatever. And what are we all walking around with? We're all walking around with recording devices.
Yeah.
Right? So incredibly valuable. And I think that's the thing that people do wrong. And I think we need to be better is understanding in this new world, what is the real currency that these guys want. So that's one thing. And then another thing, simple thing that I'm a big fan of talking about, especially now more than ever, is get an understanding of your smart devices. You got so many people all working together, kids, parents, spouses, everyone's now using the same network. And not only do we have so many of us at home doing all this stuff because of COVID-19, but we've got all these appliances that are smart and everything's connected. And we got to remember, the bad guy will choose the easiest route in. And once they're in one thing that you think, oh, who's gonna hack my fridge? Nobody cares about that. Yeah. Sure. Once they're in one aspect, from there they can hop and they can get to other aspects. So those would be the two things. Take note of the new currency, understand we live in a new world, and take note of your smart devices.
Got it. Amazing advice, Danny. And I guess as a follow-up question regarding the smart devices, because I was reading some of your articles and watching some of your videos, I had a Google Home Mini. I just unplugged it. Like I don't even use it anymore. but, but I mean, I guess now when you say that we should get to understand our smart devices, do you, I guess does that mean like from a security standpoint? Does that mean like should we disable such functions where it's always on or always listening and that kind of stuff? Or
Well, that is a personal preference.
okay.
So that's not something that you have to have disabled, but instead, I would ask yourself, does it need to be a smart version of what you have?
Ah,
Right? Certain things, we have them just for the sake of having them. And I might ask somebody, well, why do you actually need that? So there was a case of a friend of mine, and he had a smart fridge, and he was sort of, proudly showing it off to me. And I said, so what kind of security do you have on this thing? Right?
yeah.
Because I honestly didn't get what, I didn't really get the benefits of him having a smart fridge. So I'm like, so, okay, so sounds interesting, I guess. Well, what kind of security do you have on this thing? And he goes, well, what do I need security on this thing? He goes, I don't care if somebody knows, how I like my ice cubes. And I was like, okay. So I kind of explained my thing about, the weakest part of the network. And then from there, you can hop to something, a little bit more impactful to you. But I go, but let's pretend you had nothing else on your network, just that one fridge. There was a case where there was a neighborhood where hackers were hacking on houses with smart fridges, and they were checking to see how often that door was open and closed. And with that, they were able to determine when that house was empty. Because it's like, okay, the door wasn't touched for X amount of time. It's got to be empty at such and such time. And they use that to rob the home. So even in and that's not sophisticated at all. That's just hacking one point and sticking to that one point. Even in a non-sophisticated hack, it could still pose a lot of trouble. So I wouldn't necessarily be the one to tell people whether you should leave it on all the time, but I would be the one to tell people, ask yourself, do you actually need to go this route to begin with? Is it really going to change your life that much, right? If you don't go that route.
Wow, amazing, Danny. So, Danny, I mean, let's, I guess, switch the conversation over to talking more about organizations as well. So, obviously, COVID-19 has caused a lot of organizations to work 100% remote, 100% from home, all the employees working remotely. What advice do you have for such organizations? Because obviously, it's no longer that corporate environment where they have a whole, those security measures and the technology in place. Now what you got now is a whole bunch of employees now currently working from home from their home internet service providers. So what are some of the risks that these organizations, could potentially be facing because of this change in environment and change in the way things are being done? And how can the organizations safeguard themselves and their employees?
Sure. No, excellent question. So one of the things that you'll know when you talk to me is I always bring things back to threats and vulnerabilities, right? So if you're talking about, what's some of the trouble that they're facing right now? Well, if we look at the threats, so during COVID-19, as things really started to get serious, as the world started to realize, yeah, this isn't going away anytime soon, what we started seeing was a massive spike in cyber breaches or attempts for cyber breaches. And that goes back to when I talked about how these guys love playing on our emotions. And yes, this is a very emotional time for a lot of people. And so cyber criminals are using that to their advantage. So just because typical business might have slowed down, cybercrime is skyrocketing. These guys are out in full force and they're looking to take advantage of our emotional state. So that's the threat. And that's a threat that all businesses need to be concerned about. That's a threat all society needs to be concerned about. As for the vulnerability is yeah, this is probably the biggest work from home project that has existed ever. And did we have, as organizations, when they implemented this, did we have 3 months to put this in place? And hey, we want to make sure we're doing this properly. No, it was like, boom, snap your fingers. 1 week we're doing things normally. Another week everyone's at home and everyone's working from home. And that's a huge vulnerability. Combine that with the fact that the threat is very big as well. So what I tell people is in addition to, yes, you have to have your technology up to date. You have to have your, make sure your VPNs are in place. I'm not going to talk about that here. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is you want to make sure you have a very good work from home policy. And it's never too late. I mean, if someone's watching this thinking, holy cow, but my team's been home, for all of March and I'm seeing this thing in May now. Is it too late? It's never too late. And the work from home policy doesn't have to be something that's overly complicated. But if you start off with the expectations that you have for your team. If you have expectations for your team, if you want them to act a certain way, if you want them to have certain things in place or do things with a certain type of safeguard, you've got to let them know. A lot of times, leaders will know things that they want them to do, but they haven't actually communicated that to their employees.
Mm-hmm.
So put that down in a policy. If you have an understanding of what is the employee supposed to do if they think they've been compromised, let them know. Do they know that? Have you told them that? Yeah. And don't just put it in an email and send it to them. Hold a webinar, talk to them about it and say, guys, this is what our policy is. But in addition to that, so that's one part of the plan, have a really good work from home policy. The SANS Institute has some really great templates on that about work from home policies and how to build your own. But in addition to that, talk to your teams about how they can talk to their families about this. Mm-hmm. And this is going to work as a corporation, this is going to work for you twofold. One, listen, they're all on the same network anyways. So if their family is doing something incredibly bad security-wise, that's going to affect your employees, which is going to affect your network. So if you're protecting their families, you are protecting your networks and your business, okay? But the other thing, that's how to get the employees on side. You've got to let them know, listen, this isn't just important to our company, but this is about protecting your family. And if we get them on side, which is the absolute truth, and we get them realizing this, then you're really going to get them taking this seriously. And it's not just going to be, take this training because it's mandatory, you have to do it, and the person just clicks through and doesn't actually pay attention, right? Let them know why they need to pay attention. So home policy and talk to them about how they can also safeguard their family.
Okay, excellent. So, and from what you're saying, Danny, like basically show them what's in it for them and their families.
100%.
Okay. All right.
100%.
Makes sense. Okay. Now, Danny, being a cybersecurity expert yourself, like, I'd definitely like to hear more. And if you can share with our viewers, what are some of the major challenges that cybersecurity experts such as yourself face in safeguarding not just individuals, obviously, and organizations? And what are some of the suggestions or advice you would have for other, your fellows or your peers in the cybersecurity industry?
Excellent question. And it ties into some of what I might have touched on your last question.
Yeah.
So let's talk about risk in general, and let's talk about understanding risk just before I get to the question, okay?
Sure.
We talk about understanding risk, and you talk about, well, let's analyze risk, and we need to make people aware of a risk before I can start training you on cybersecurity. Now, if I talk to anyone who analyzes risk for a living, case in point, somebody who works in insurance, that's their job, is analyzing risk, okay? Yeah. You talk to anyone who analyzes risk for a living, and you ask them, how do you analyze risk? They'll tell you, you look at the impact and you look at the probability. And so, so when we talk about risk for what you and I are talking about, most people I find in society, most businesses do understand the impacts associated with cybercrime risk or cyber risk, right? We've seen the news reports, we see the numbers, a lot of numbers, millions here, billions here, trillions here, it's gonna cost this much, it's gonna cost that much. We get it, right? And I find that because we get that the impacts are big, I find that if you pull someone aside, anybody, whether they're some sort of business leader, whether they're a citizen of any kind, you pull them aside, you say, hey, cybercrime, you know this, it's serious? They'll say, yeah, man, impacts, a lot of money, very serious stuff. And because we think we get that, we think we understand the risks. The problem is where we break down is we don't get the probability, and we don't truly respect the probability. So yeah, we get it's expensive. We just think it's somebody else's problem. We don't believe in the probability that this is going to be our problem or that this is going to be the problem for our organization. So even after all these stories and even after all these years, the number one thing that I hear, the number one thing that I need to fight against, the most challenging part of what I do is when somebody says to me, it's not going to come after me. Nobody wants what I have. And I hear that from business leaders. I hear that from individuals. And that's why I'm always saying, yes, you absolutely do have something that is valuable to cyber criminals. That's probably, and that was actually ties back to the very first question you asked me, but that is probably one of the most important things that I educate people on is you absolutely have something of value to cyber criminals. And then I speak to that, and I speak to letting people know what that is. because a lot of times people will only accumulate it to, hey, it's not like I have millions of dollars in the bank or billions of dollars in the bank. Why would they want me? Doesn't matter, right? And so what I tell people is the way that I work around that is I really work on addressing that first, improving that point first, and giving different stats that speak to that and say, okay, this organization had no money. Schools, as an example, high schools, elementary schools, cyber criminals are targeting them. Now, if we're talking about publicly funded elementary schools and high schools, they have no money, they have no budget. Yeah. It doesn't matter to the criminal. And you need to let people know that everyone is a target, because if they truly don't believe they're a target, then none of your lesson is really going to matter. You got to get them on side first. And that's my biggest challenge. And that's really how I work with it is I work by tackling that first, getting them to believe it.
Okay, amazing. So from what you're saying, Danny, the biggest challenge is simply individuals and organizations saying, hey, it could never happen to me.
That's it. That's it.
Right.
And not, when they say it could never happen to me, it's not so much out of I'm too well protected. It's more so, why would anyone want to target me? I've got nothing anyone wants. I hear that time and time again. And I hear people say, but I'm broke, or I got nothing but debt, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay. I mean, folks, this is some great and very, very helpful and useful information. And it's just great information. Now, from this in the cybersecurity space itself, Danny, can you share any trends that you see in cybersecurity, and not just trends in the technology and the security measures itself, but also trends in threats and attacks?
Absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll answer that question in reverse. So let's start with the last part of what you said. So the trends from cybercrime itself. I think the biggest trend that I'm seeing, and the biggest shift from, compared to when I first started 20 years ago, is that this is a thriving criminal industry. This isn't something where it's somebody having fun, a lone person having fun wearing a hoodie like in all those pictures, right? and sending out some hacker just so they can brag to their friends and say, hey, look what I did. Like, 20 years ago, as an example, when I'd be working with an organization and we'd be talking about their biggest fears, they might say to me, oh, hey, my website, xyz.com, as an example, they might say, my biggest fear is I don't want somebody to hack that site and then write XYZ sucks. Because that's really what hacking was back then. People would hack, they would deface a site, and it was really kind of fun. Mm-hmm. Now people make serious money doing this stuff, right? Very, very serious money. Or it could be, again, some form of cyber terrorism, some form of state-sponsored attack. And when that changes, the entire industry and the entire threat level changes. It's not for fun anymore. This isn't to deface something. It's not vandalism, online vandalism. It's a real industry where people are employed as a cyber criminal. That's their job. They don't have a full-time job that they then go home to and do this on the side. They're doing this full-time. So I'd say that's probably the biggest and the most relevant trend worth pointing out. In terms of what I see from cybersecurity, so now on the opposite side of things, a trend that I'm really happy about is I'm seeing there's so much change in cybersecurity. It's been happening now for a few years, whereas it's so much bigger than IT, so much bigger than software, so much bigger than hardware. As an example, it's not uncommon that I'll have a meeting and we're discussing cybersecurity, and as a part of that meeting, I've got a cyber insurance specialist that's as a part of that, and we're on the same team. Cyber insurance, what's cyber insurance? Well, it's the same thing as regular insurance, except it's meant to insure this stuff, right? This was something in the not too distant past. You just weren't having that conversation. There was no way to get insurance for that sort of stuff. But then also, sometimes as a part of that same meeting, we have something called a breach lawyer, cyber breach coach, rather. What's a breach coach? A breach coach is a lawyer that specializes in what to do in these situations. And it's like, wow, the team's really changing. And then, of course, I've been in other cases where there's even a cybersecurity PR specialist, and they're working with a big PR firm, and their main role is dealing with cybersecurity PR or cyber incident PR issues. And that's what I think is the biggest change, and it's a change that I love, where it's moving beyond IT, hardware, software, moving into insurance, law, PR, because it has to be. because we got to compete with all the different things out there, not to mention, of course, all the regulations with regards to breaches as well. It's a complicated world, and I think cybersecurity is maturing with those complications.
Understood. Now, Danny, and just kind of a follow-up question to that, like in terms of threats versus the associated, emerging technology that comes out of this, is it a chicken versus egg scenario? Like, what comes first, like the threat, and then the the technology or the measures to protect it, or is it that you anticipate the kind of threats and then that's how the trend or the technology emerges is, or is it not that simple?
You know what? I know it's a great question, and I have seen cases of both, right?
Okay.
So I have seen cases where absolutely there's a threat that comes out, and the industry then responds. Says, well, based on this threat, we need to respond, and we need to come up with this. The threat might then say, well, then I'm going to come up with another way around. The industry then responds. But there has been cases that I've seen, especially within law enforcement, where they're doing threat intelligence. They've got their own people on the dark web checking to see what's the chatter out there, what are people talking about, and what's going to be the next thing attacked. And they'll use that information to be very proactive and to have some sort of proactive safeguards. So you do see a combination of both, absolutely. And okay. I think that's going to be something that we're going to continue to see. Unfortunately, for half of that is unfortunate. Half of that is pretty cool, but the other half is unfortunate.
Okay, got it. So Danny, I mean, any advice you can share for new graduates as well as those maybe in a different part of IT or technology looking to make a switch into cybersecurity? Any advice?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the last part of your question first about
yeah.
just people looking to make a change.
Yeah.
Man, my advice is do it. Cybersecurity, I'll tell you a quick story. So is in 2008, I was running a cybersecurity team, and I had an opportunity to hire someone. And I had two of my friends that were out of work at this time, and they were in the cybersecurity industry. And I didn't care that somebody else didn't want them. I knew I wanted at least one of them. I knew I could trust them. I knew they were good. And so I called them in separately for the interview, and you wouldn't believe the hard time they were giving me on the interview. What can you tell me? Why should I come here? I don't know. I don't know if I'm that interested. I'm like, what can I tell you? You're unemployed. I'm offering you a job. I don't understand. Why do I feel like I'm losing here, right? And I'm like, maybe they're just the world's greatest bluffers. You know what? They weren't bluffing. They didn't come work for me. They went somewhere else. Wow. And when I found out, I asked, how did I lose that battle? And they're like, Danny, the minute we let people know that we were a free agent and we're looking for work, and we are in the cybersecurity field, they're like, the amount of job offers that came our way, we were flooded. Wow. And this was in 2008. Back then, I did not read a single stat about the cybersecurity skills gap. I didn't know it, but I started talking to some peers of mine. I started talking to other people in similar roles, and I was asking them, are you guys seeing this as a problem? Are you guys seeing that there are way more jobs than there are qualified people to fill them in this industry? And everyone kept saying yes. It wasn't until 2013 that I saw my first stat about it, where people started actually noticing and actually running stats on this, saying, yeah, I think this is going to be a huge problem because, the way that we're going, it doesn't seem like there's going to be enough people to fill these jobs. So every year after 2013, it seemed like that gap kept widening. So that being said, if you like helping people, if you like learning new things, meeting people, and if you want an industry where you're most likely never going to run out of a job, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Now, as for those people that have already made that decision, and as for those people who are already in this and they're graduating, so to go back to the beginning part of your question, the best piece of advice that I would have for you is just look to start working. What I notice is there's a few people, and I'm super friendly on with this information, super friendly on social media, and I think because of that, a lot of people do reach out to me and say, "Hey, I just graduated. Can you help me?" And some of them would say something like, "I graduated 4 months ago. I'm having some trouble landing a job. Can you tell me what I'm doing wrong?" And so almost always what the situation seems to be is the jobs they're going for jobs that are asking for 2 or 3 years of work experience. And almost every time when I ask them, so guys, do you have 2 or 3 years work experience? Because you told me you just graduated 4 months ago. And they're like, well, no, I don't. And I'm like, you really got to go for something entry level. Then if you have no work experience, you got to go for a job where they're asking for someone that doesn't have work experience. And a lot of times their response will be, yeah, but I think I can do better. Sure, I'm sure you are super talented. I'm sure one day you're going to go on to do amazing things. But if the job requirement says you need 2 to 3 years work experience and you are saying I have zero work experience, that's just not going to fly. It's just not going to work, right? Get a job somewhere, get your foot in the door, have it say something to do with cybersecurity, make it be entry level, and from there, then you build. And once you're in, and you go from there. But that would be the best piece of advice I would give to anyone is just get in. Don't worry about it being an amazing job that you can brag to your friends about. I mean, what was I doing 20 years ago? I was working at Chuck E. Cheese making pizzas, right? We got to do what we got to do. You got to start somewhere, right? And so when I made the transition from Chuck E. Cheese to my first security job, I'll tell you this, I took whatever I can find. I didn't start looking for something that was higher up on the ladder. I just wanted to start working in the industry, and that's where you build your brand, you start learning, and you also discover other things about the industry that you love. You're going to be able to discover so much more about the industry when you start working in it than you could ever discover in school. So yeah, get a job, take something entry level, get in, and then you work your way up, and you're going to love it.
Awesome. I mean, great advice, Danny. I completely agree with that. Getting your foot in the door, folks, very important if you're looking to start your career, and just get yourself in there. Completely agree with that. So, Danny, before we wrap up, I mean, where can people follow you and connect with you for your posts? I will be sharing that information, but definitely wanted to hear from you. Like, where do you prefer people to connect with you?
Absolutely. So I think where I seem to be the most disciplined is I seem to be the most disciplined on LinkedIn. At one time, I was really good with Twitter. And then I think I got frustrated with them, and I still like them. I still use them. Yeah. So my Twitter handle is @Danny Pehar. LinkedIn, you just do a search for Danny Pehar, or follow, of course, the link that you're going to post. I find sometimes, when you meet someone and they tell you their name is John Smith, and they say, yeah, find me on LinkedIn, my name's John Smith, and you type in John Smith, and there's like 10,000 John Smiths. I checked LinkedIn earlier today. It does seem to be only one Danny Pehar so far, fingers crossed, but that doesn't change. Do a search for Danny Pehar on LinkedIn. Let's connect. That's probably the one I'm most disciplined on. And yes, I do use Twitter. I'm just not as disciplined with Twitter as I used to be.
Awesome. And Danny, what kind of posts and content can people expect from you on LinkedIn?
So I try to keep a mix between organizational cybersecurity as well as individual cybersecurity. So it's very similar to what you and I talked about today. I like to have a mix on both of those, and then maybe the occasional very, very random, I will talk about employment or something like that, just how to find a job, and nothing to do with cybersecurity. I am a big fan of getting young people working. And so occasionally I do talk about careers and that sort of stuff. But mostly it's going to be cybersecurity, and it's going to toggle between what organizations should do and what individuals should do.
Awesome. Sounds good. And yeah, folks, if you're watching this, make sure you connect with Danny on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. I will be sharing those posts again. It'll be in the description of the comments. I follow Danny's posts myself. Very, very insightful, very easy to understand as well, right? I mean, although I do recruit in IT, I'm a non-technical, I'm not a technical hands-on kind of person in IT. So it's very easy for me to understand. A lot of great information. And Danny, you shared so much great information with us today. I really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy. And, again, really appreciate your time. And it's been a pleasure having you on the series.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure, Dean. And a pleasure watching when you post these. I really like watching the stuff. There was one where you were talking about careers and whatnot. I really loved it. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of what you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danny. I appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone. Everyone have a good day.
Take care, Dean.